Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching History Summarized Sicily by Overly Sarcastic Productions. Now this was actually a recommendation by one of you guys, since I always seem to really enjoy the history videos from OSP, and I know that Blue has a particular interest in medieval Italy. He always enjoys to talk about it in a lot of their history videos, so I suspect this will be a good one. Plus, Sicily is a really fascinating, sort of cosmopolitan place, so there's a lot to dig into. Now, if you guys end up enjoying this one, I'd appreciate it if you would leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
Despite the best attempts of literally every civilization in history, they all fall down eventually, and that's just part of the game. You rise, you fall, business is business.
Yeah, nothing is permanent. I mean, so far, we can't see the future, but so far nothing has been permanent. All of these empires and states eventually collapse. And when you're in the moment, that may seem impossible. What? The countries around us today, they could collapse one day? But if we judge by history, they probably will at some point. Collapse or change, morph, transform. It's not like everything crumbles into dust, right? Things change into something new, but nothing stays the same.
Now, sometimes there comes a rare society so catastrophically unfortunate that even their own culture forgets that they existed. And that becomes doubly tragic when it's a really cool one, too. Because when it comes to Italy, we can talk a lot, like... a lot about...
Oh, I know you can. But, I mean, there are a lot of places around the world where you have, civilizations built upon civilizations built upon civilizations, right? If you dig deep enough, and sometimes we literally mean dig, right? This is the work of an archaeologist. You can find the history and culture that has been left behind that, we have built upon. So places that have been settled for hundreds, thousands of years, you can find this around the world.
About the northy bits with all the Vembus and Florms, but meanwhile, popular memory of the millennia-spanning history of southern Italy is buried under 2 tons of Neapolitan pizza, mafia movies, and icky World War II stuff. In one of Europe's weirdest cases of collective amnesia, a reputation for poverty now dominates a region that was known for multiculturalism, magnificent architecture, and exquisite intellect. Not just another case of this place was shiny and then it wasn't. The civilization of southern Italy and Sicily was so distinct and impressive that their later neglect is far more tragic than their actual downfall.
Yeah, there was a lot of culture, wealth, and cosmopolitanism, diversity, right? Sicily, southern Italy, if you look at their location, Sicily's location, say, in the Mediterranean, it's not surprising that it was a gathering place for peoples from all over the Mediterranean world. So it really hosted a lot of different art, culture, language, and yeah, I think that is something that, we maybe don't talk about enough today, that has sort of been washed over by more recent history, though, like I said, that happens in a lot of places, unfortunately.
So, to find out what was so special about Naples and Sicily and see how their name got stomped into the dust, let's do some history. Being smack in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, Sicily has a distinctly social history, starting with Greece.
Yeah, like I said, you are pretty accessible to a lot of different peoples from around the Mediterranean.
In the ancient period, the south of Italy was packed full of Greek cities built by settlers from the east. With natural resources aplenty and lots of room to grow, several colonies became richer and sometimes even more powerful than the mainland cities.
Even a lot of this has been forgotten, You think about Italy and Sicily in the ancient world, and most people will immediately go to the Roman Empire. And, I get it, right? Rome is such a monumental thing in ancient history that it's hard to look past it. But, as is being pointed out, Sicily and a lot of southern Italy was settled by Greeks, relatively sort of late into antiquity, right? If we want to look at the entire period. And there was, of course, Greek influence even after that point.
Athenian Empire discovered the hard way. The people of this Western Hellenic civilization were known as Italiotai, but the land was known as Magna Graecia according to their neighbors, the Romans. This corner of the Hellenic world happens to be the young Roman Republic's first contact with Greek culture, and needless to say, it left a strong impression. Magna Graecia was Rome's entryway to the Greek East, and
Yeah, well, Rome, encountered Etruscan civilization, and it was like, all right, let's take all of that. And then they encountered Greek civilization, and they were like, let's take a lot of that. I mean, the Romans were pretty good at that, encountering new culture and civilization, and taking a lot of what they liked.
as it happens, the accidental flashpoint for their conflicts with Carthage, thus beginning the very apt visual metaphor of Sicily getting kicked. After Rome's conquest of the Mediterranean...
Yeah, I mean, we talk about the Punic Wars. Sicily was very much a ball being kicked back and forth between Rome and Carthage. It was one of the most important battlefields, frankly, of those wars, and it was very much contested. So once again, we can see Sicily's place sort of in the middle of all of this, a contested place, a place of mixing and mingling.
Mediterranean, southern Italy, and Sicily produced much of the empire's grain and were well positioned for maritime trade and Greco-Roman cultural exchange. One metric empire later, Italy was Byzantine. Briefly.
For a bit.
Though they reconquered the peninsula from the Goths in the mid-500s, their work was undone with almost insulting swiftness by a Germanic people called the Lombards, who poured over the Alps in the decade after and made the peninsula a checkerboard.
Yeah, the Byzantines retook the Eastern Romans under, of course, Justinian, and through the work of Belisarius, retook North Africa and Italy for a little bit. It didn't last very long. Of course, it wasn't instantly all retaken, but... and I'm sure this will be discussed in this video, even after the Roman Empire didn't officially control this territory anymore, there was still a lot of Byzantine, aka Roman at this point, artistic, cultural influence in the area, especially artistic.
Carving out duchies all across the north and in pockets of the south. A few centuries later, the new threat came from across the sea, as Muslim conquerors gradually wrestled Sicily from the Byzantines over the course of the 800s. So by the year 1000, the situation in Italy goeth thusly. In the north, the Lombard duchies became domains of the Holy Roman, German Empire, and the northern Byzantine territories of Venice and the Papal States had become independent. So broadly, the north was chill. Meanwhile, southwards, the Byzantines are holding on to the pointy bits of the boot in Calabria.
I mean, we're a far way from a unified Italy. We've got an Italy that's sort of a patchwork of different states, empires, and peoples.
And Apulia, while the Duchy of Naples is technically still a Byzantine state, but is essentially on its own, just sailing around for happy merchant fun times. Inland, the Lombard duchies of Benevento, Salerno, and Capua were locked in a cycle of breaking and reassembling, and, of course, Sicily belonged to the Saracens. The south was having quite a rough time. And then the Normans came.
Uh-oh.
As if our cast list isn't complex enough, our next players come from the opposite end of Europe on the north coast of France.
Yeah, add some more people in. Honestly, medieval history is not my area of expertise, and this is how I feel when we talk about a lot of sort of medieval European or Mediterranean history. It seems like there are just a lot of small centers of power, a lot of empires and states, and they're constantly competing and moving and taking this and taking that. It's all incredibly complex, which I think is one of the reasons why it's intriguing and one of the things that attracts people to it, but it also makes it a little difficult to track exactly what is going on.
There, Scandinavian Viking raiders had been generously bribed by the Frankish king to sit down, stay put, and stop attacking Paris. These Northmen, or Nordmani, became Christians and learned French, but maintained that characteristically Scandinavian desire to sail places and fight stuff.
Yeah, they were a menace.
So they became extremely successful mercenaries around their home base in Normandy, as well as in the south of Italy, where, given the state of things, it was a good time to be in the mercenary business.
Yeah, when you look at the Mediterranean around this period, you will see the Normans popping up in a lot of different places on a lot of different sides.
In the early 1000s, they fought for the Lombards against the Byzantines and for the Byzantines against the Lombards. Now, exploiting conflict for financial gain is distressingly standard practice, but the Normans had a knack for getting land out of the deal. So, in 1043, they gained a slice of Apulia, and then they kept on going. The Normans had the best army in the south by far, and over the decades they chipped away at the Lombards, Byzantines, Sicilian Muslims, and a couple couple of times even the Pope. By 1091, Duke Roger I conquered all of Sicily and southern Italy except for a tiny sliver on the Bay of Naples. In 1130, the Pope crowned Roger II as King of Sicily, and 7 years later, the Normans nabbed Naples to cap the set. So, having consolidated the entire South for the first time in half a millennium, what kind of kingdom was Roger working with? Simply put, the king and his royal court were multilingual, and they needed to be.
Yeah.
The mainland was home to French-speaking Normans, Byzantine Greeks, the descendants of the Lombards who spoke an early form of Italian, while Sicily was sporting a mix of Muslim Arabic speakers and post-Byzantine Grek boys.
Yeah, and when we talk about Sicily and southern Italy being very cosmopolitan, I think this is often the period that we think of. And, this is characteristic for a lot of sort of pre-modern history. The nation state, the way we know it, is a relatively modern invention over the last couple of 100 years. And if you look at a lot of places, say throughout Europe, if you use Europe as an example, you will find an incredible mix of different ethnicities at this time period. And a lot of these different peoples were within the same state or the same empire. A nation state, the idea hadn't really been formed yet, but it wasn't really possible at this point. I mean, you were governing over so many different peoples that it would have been pretty difficult to pursue a sort of modern nation state, aka a state centered around one ethnicity or one people. This was a very cosmopolitan and diverse world, and a lot of these empires ruled over a lot of different peoples. And of course, that would last until, in some cases, relatively recent history, as nation states consolidated. But here we can see, a polity that is very cosmopolitan, deals with a lot of different cultures and a lot of different peoples and religions and languages, And so, that can be a little difficult sometimes, but it wouldn't have appeared too unusual to the people of this era. Now, having people of different religions was always a difficulty, but there were a lot of places that had mixes of people.
This multicultural atmosphere was a product of circumstance, but Duke Roger I took it as an advantage and ran with it. So the young Roger II grew up learning from Greek and Muslim tutors, and upon becoming king, he doubled down by setting out a new legal code in 1140, which established equal rights for all subjects regardless of religion or ethnicity.
I mean, you can think about, at this same time, you have the Ottoman Empire growing in the east, and they ruled over a lot of different peoples, right? Religiously, of course, they ruled over Muslims, they had Jewish subjects, they had Christian subjects, and of course those Christian subjects would over time break down into Catholic and Orthodox, and of course in the Ottoman Empire, Islam was the prime religion, but they tolerated other people having their own religions and their own religious communities, and to a certain extent, they let them sort of do their own thing. And of course, the ethnic breakdown was even more complicated than that, and that was a sort of great and powerful empire. Although, of course, different empires handled things differently. You get into the sort of late Middle Ages, you'll deal with Reconquista in the Iberian Peninsula, where the Christians go around kicking anybody who's not Christian enough out, and, a lot of the people they kicked out were Jewish, and a lot of those people ended up going to the Ottoman Empire. So you've got a very complex mix here.
Drawing inspiration from Norman French law, Islamic law, and Byzantine law from as far back as Justinian, this hybrid code built a centralized Norman state, but specifically allowed for local customs to pick up where statewide laws left off. That said, this was still very much a monarchy, and the king had final say on everything, but it's remarkable that Roger cultivated such an enthusiastically pluralistic state. And against the context of the Crusades actively going on in the Holy Land, Norman Sicily is utterly wild. A multicultural home for scholars and traders from all over.
Yeah, don't get multiculturalism or a sort of pluralistic society mixed up with one that isn't authoritarian. I mean, you can have a multicultural and pluralistic society that is democratic or has popular sovereignty, but you can also have that and have a monarchy, right? I mean, there are lots of examples throughout history of monarchs who, were able to listen to their people a little bit more, would listen to the different interest groups of their empire. And of course, there are a lot of examples of monarchs who did not listen to their people, did not listen to the interest groups in their state. and truly acted single-mindedly. You know, with any form of government, there are a lot of different ways you can do it.
To that end, Norman coinage was stamped in Latin and Arabic and became extremely popular for long-distance trade in every direction. Sicilian wheat and citrus exports were off the charts, and all that cash paid for quite an impressive building program back home. When the Normans arrived,
some things never change. They're still growing a lot of wheat and using it to pay the bills, just as it was in the Roman Empire. I think you mentioned this earlier. Sicily was one of the breadbaskets of the Roman Empire, produced a lot of the wheat for the entire empire, and, you know, that is still the case at that point.
Italy's architecture mirrored its linguistic diversity, with Byzantine architecture here, Islamic architecture over there, and Romanesque sprinkled in between. They would soon realize that it looks really good when put together. And so, the multiculture of Norman Italy took a physical form in buildings like the Cappella Palatina in the Royal Palace of Palermo. The structure of the church is a Latin cross, but nearly every surface is drenched in golden Byzantine mosaics, including the very Byzantine dome.
And like I said, despite the cultural and religious differences between the West and the Byzantine East, if you look up and down Italy at this point, especially in some of these states, city-states, that were getting rich, they took a lot of influence from Byzantine art. Sometimes they literally took Byzantine art, but you will find a lot of these Byzantine-inspired, you know, buildings and churches and all this kind of stuff throughout Italy. And I, for one, I think it's beautiful. I really like this style of architecture and art, you know, the gold, and I think it's really fascinating. And I think it's really cool to see something like this, you know, a building or whatever, where you can see a mix of different cultures and artistic styles, because if you know about them, if you're familiar, and, you know, this is not my field of expertise, but you can sort of pick through and go, all right, this is from here. Oh, yeah, and this is identifiably from this culture. So it's sort of fascinating to get a mix.
Meanwhile, classical Corinthian columns are capped with Arabic arches which lead up to colorful Islamic stalactite vaulting on the ceiling and to inscriptions written in Greek, Latin, and Arabic. Lots of fancy words to say the place is freaking gorgeous, and the synthesis of all these different styles represents the great accomplishment of Norman Italian society.
Yeah, it makes it very distinctive as well. It's the kind of thing where the mix of these different styles makes something entirely unique that, you know, you're not going to find in a lot of other places. I think you also find some of this, you know, mix of Christian and Islamic styles on the Iberian Peninsula, because of course that was controlled by Muslims for a period of time. I think especially in southern Spain. I've never been, but you can still find a lot of Islamic architecture and Islamic influences. So yeah, I think it's fascinating.
Another major outlet was scholarship. With simultaneous
Right.
access to Greek, Latin, and Arabic sources in one place, plus local geniuses in every field and branch of knowledge, southern Italy might have been one of the single smartest places in the medieval world at the time. And everyone could participate, as, for example, many Muslims worked in the royal court, Arab mathematicians handled finance, and the cartographer Muhammad al-Idrisi spent 15 years working on a map of the world for King Roger. The tabula
Yeah, I mean, at this point, if you want to have access to a lot of that knowledge, ancient knowledge that a lot of people don't have access to, the way to do it is to have a community of scholars that includes Christian scholars and, you know, Muslim Arabic scholars and Jewish scholars, because they can really bring everything together. You can do translations back and forth. You know, that's how you have the most access to the knowledge of antiquity at this time.
Rogeriana was the most accurate and detailed map ever made, and in addition to a circular drawing
I feel like I've seen that map before.
world, al-Idrisi made a mammoth 70-piece
Whoa.
chart of the Northern Hemisphere, with each subsection described at length in the whole-ass encyclopedia that he made alongside the maps. The book was written in Arabic and in Latin, though everyone at the court could read both anyway, and this astounding feat of scholarship pairs like a fine Sicilian wine alongside the Cappella Palatina in illustrating what made Norman Italy so uniquely fascinating. So, here's what went wrong.
Uh-oh.
The royal Hauteville family stayed in power.
Look, as we said, nothing lasts forever. right? Everything is going to change eventually.
Through the rest of the 1100s, doing their
Even your favorite historical state or empire will collapse eventually. And it has collapsed.
thing, occasionally dabbling in pointless wars with the Byzantines, and ultimately sealing their fate with some dodgy marriages that handed the crown to the royal German Hohenstaufen family in 1194. And the next century sees Sicily pivot away from the Mediterranean to instead face north toward mainland Europe, and this resulted in the steady disassembly of everything the Hautevils worked for. In 1224, all Muslims were expelled from Sicily to Apulia, but they were kicked out of the kingdom in
Yeah, so you're seeing some of that. And this is not my period, but I mentioned the Reconquista. I think at a certain point you start seeing more antagonism, and you see Christian states essentially moving or deporting a lot of the non-Christian, particularly Muslim inhabitants, right? I mean, that's what happened in the Reconquista. And of course, a lot of times Jewish residents will get caught up in this, often purposefully. And we're seeing some of that here as Europe. I mean, Europe, you already have sort of Christendom at this point, but I suppose it's sort of very much solidifying.
Entirely at the end of the century, because while the Hohenstaufen family were at least half Norman and had some respect for the kingdom's history, the rulers who came after were not at all, and thus had none. In 1266, the whole south was conquered by the French Count Charles of Anjou, but 16 years later, Sicily was invaded by the King of Aragon in the War of the Sicilian Vespers. Big mess, lots of stabbing, end result in 1302 is that Sicily belongs to Aragon while the mainland stays French. For the next few centuries, the histories of Sicily and Naples diverge in their politics, style, and language, but it's the same basic story. Dominion by an outside state that didn't understand the territory and couldn't enforce a strong central authority through anything but violence. Power fell to local cities and aristocratic estates, and while this problem dated back to the Hautevils, they could actually keep their barons in line. Here, not so much. Although the Sicilians may have welcomed Spanish rule as a relief from the domineering...
Well, we talk about Italy like it's one thing, and of course there is the modern state of Italy, the country, and we have an idea of the territory that is Italy. At this point there is no unified Italy, and there are, especially further up north, there are a couple of powerful Italian states, but, following the collapse of the Roman Empire throughout the Middle Ages, essentially up until sort of Italian unification, or at least like the 19th century, maybe a little bit before Italian unification, Italy will find itself playing host to a lot of different powers who will sort of come in, these, great states, come in from abroad, conquer a bit of territory, hold it. Italy will find itself very much sort of chopped up among a bunch of different states.
Hatred of the Angevin French, the result of being pleasantly ignored is that they were largely neglected. And as Sicily entered the 1300s tethered to distant Iberia rather than Italy, they would miss the Renaissance entirely.
Damn.
The Cold War between the Aragonese and the Angevins was broken when Aragon conquered Naples in 1443, so in 1494 the King of France marched an army down the peninsula in an attempt to retake Naples. And they did, for a year, but Aragon came back, fighting, and by 1504 the south was firmly Spanish and the story settles down.
You essentially, at this point, you just got the French and the Spanish marching up and down Italy, fighting over territory.
In the south. In the north, the fighting continued, subjecting those poor defenseless scamps to 65 years of invasions.
Damn.
Wild times, way off topic. With a few brief exceptions, Sicily and Naples remains loosely ruled by Spanish royals and locally controlled by the Spanish nobles
I like our exceptions up top.
who had vast amounts of land and wealth. After the discovery of the New World, southern Italy had stopped being particularly useful, but with Spain now drowning in...
Yeah, Spain found some other interests, and those other interests were collecting massive amounts of silver from Latin America, Potosi in particular, making themselves fabulously rich, and then sort of drowning in all this silver and inflation and declining over time.
empire money, they could afford to spruce the place up a bit. In 1693, eastern Sicily suffered a devastating earthquake, so with space to build and cash to burn, the aristocracy and the church got to work on their new digs. Entire cities were replanned from scratch, and this rebuilt Sicily took on its own flavor of Baroque architecture. It's got classical elements if you squint, but it's dense, swooshy, and very expensive looking. And yet, the extravagant grandeur of southern Italian architecture did nothing to make life better for the impoverished masses. I can't imagine why.
Well, of course not. That is sort of one of the characteristics of this period. We see in this sort of Renaissance, late Middle Ages type era, some of the most fantastic pieces of grand architecture being built, especially religious architecture, churches. But we also see simultaneously, life is not so great for your average, usually peasant, right? Because most people are peasant or serf farmers. Life, not so great, but you do have this very impressive architecture being put together, you know? So clearly there's a lot of money somewhere, oftentimes concentrated in powerful people, states, and of course the church.
To make matters even worse for Sicilians, after the Napoleonic Wars, the kingdoms of Naples and Sicily were combined into the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, ruled from Naples, much to the disappointment of the Sicilians, who were now doubly second-class citizens. And this was the state of the South on the eve of Italian unification. Very long story short, Giuseppe Garibaldi and 1,000 of his buddies took advantage of a revolt in Sicily to march across the island and up to Naples to help annex the South for the new Kingdom of Italy in 1861. But the trickier task was combining the North and the South into the same country, because although they were culturally close enough, their economies were centuries apart. North Italy was...
Yeah, and there were significant differences. I mean, you see this in the creation of some of these modern nation-states. We have some sort of big notable examples, like Italy and Germany might be the two big ones. And if you think about, say, Germany, the creation of a unified German state took a lot of coercion, a lot of pressure, a lot of, at some point tolerating different cultural differences, at some point trying to stamp them out. And of course, if you were non-German, that was even more of a problem. Prussia and Germany in the East, they had a lot of Polish residents. And those Polish residents found themselves, especially at the hands of Bismarck, the target of a lot of repression as their, essentially their culture began to be stamped out by this Prussian and then German state. So, and you see this even when there's not some massive unification. Like if you look at France, people think, oh yeah, you sort of had France in the Middle Ages and then you had modern France. It's all one country. In practice, not really. It's all the same territory, but you had a lot of different governments. And if you look at France, I mean, prior to the modern era, France was a mix of a lot of different people speaking a lot of different dialects. And in order to make it the sort of modern nation state of France, well, a lot of those different cultures and dialects had to be, once again, either tolerated to a certain extent as they were slowly brought into line or sort of forcefully stamped out, right? This is what happens when you want a sort of homogenous modern nation state. And, we see this in a lot of places. Sometimes it's just more obvious than others. You can think of, say, modern Greece and Turkey. They did population exchanges, which is essentially when you deport thousands of people from one state to the other. That was, very violent and, brutal, right? So that's a obvious example, but sometimes it's a little more subtle. But yeah, you see it in a lot of places. And Italy, of course, is no exception. And even though, these projects have been largely successful in the sense that you look around the world today and you see a world filled with nation states. That is how our modern world is ordered. But you can still see some differences in a lot of these countries. And you look at Italy, and I know very little about sort of modern day Italy or modern day Italian politics or whatever, but I think it's pretty well known that there's a big split in Italy up until today between the North and the South. People think of the South as a lot less prosperous. The South is sort of viewed as struggling compared to the North. And I think there's actually a lot of resentment there between the North and the South. right? I think the sort of stereotype is that the northern Italians feel themselves sort of superior and better off, and the southern Italians feel like they've been done dirty and feel resentful. So you still see a lot of these splits that have survived past unification for whatever reason. I don't know enough about this topic. Maybe some of you can fill me in, but, it's interesting to think about.
With the Industrial Revolution, South Italy with some farms, which by this point were hopelessly outcompeted by American grain, Northerners naturally saw themselves above the inferior barbaric South, and so Southern Italians started looking for the exit, especially after Europe's most destructive earthquake ever struck Sicily in 1908.
Well, I think if you look, because of course in the United States, we have, and he might be about to get to this, in the United States, we have a lot of Italian immigrants. I think a lot, especially in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And to my understanding, a lot of those Italian immigrants were from southern Italy and Sicily. I know in the East Coast, we have a lot of people descended from Sicilians who immigrated to America.
Facing all of this and lacking in any meaningful help from the government, South Italy developed its own mechanism of enforcing social order.
We're getting to the mafia.
The mafia. Taking advantage of the power vacuum left behind by the old aristocracy, the mafia informally governed the South through private dealings and violence.
Well, if there's a power vacuum, it shall be filled, right? If, the official government or official bureaucracy isn't really tending to your area, a sort of unofficial bureaucracy will spring up. And though you might say you're referring to the mafia as an unofficial bureaucracy, I am, right? Of course, it's sort of nakedly violent and intimidating, but essentially it's sort of managing protection, money in the region, even if it does it in some ways differently than a normal government, in some ways not so differently.
In the 1920s, the mafia met their match in Mussolini, who thought that stomping them out would be good PR for the fascist party. And it kinda worked, but the alternative wasn't great, so in World War II, the Allies buddied up with the mafia for the march up the peninsula against the fascists.
I mean, look, I'd make that alliance, ally with the mafia against the fascists. That's the right move, I think.
And at the risk of dragging us into modern history, that is where we'll cap the winding tale of Sicily and southern Italy. They strike the unfortunate balance of being always in the middle, but nearly always in the background. Yet, for as much of Sicilian history...
Well, it's interesting. We have places like this throughout history that find themselves, I would say Armenia is another one of these places, that find themselves sort of in the middle of a lot of these big states and empires. So you're both in the middle, but you're also at the periphery of a lot of these different states. You might call it, the sort of academic term is a borderlands, right? A place where a lot of different states and cultures meet, but it's at sort of the edge of all of these different states. I think Armenia is another example of that from, you look at the Eastern Romans and the Persians in the modern era. Armenia is another country that's found itself in the middle, but also at the edge of a lot of powerful states and empires. There are a lot of examples of this, but I think, Sicily sort of falls into that a little bit.
It was written for...
Although, of course, right, you can't apply one idea for all of a place's history. At times, Sicily's been very important and central and rich. But I just mean generally, I think at times that is sort of, that idea of a borderlands can sort of describe this region.
Them by outside powers, it remains a product of its people, from Magna Graecia to today, but especially during the Norman Golden Age. While Sicily was no stranger to prosperity after the Hauteville kings, those riches lacked meaning. The Normans found a region locked in conflict at a time when holy war was all the rage and forged a new type of state, built on the quintessentially Norman idea that culture is harmonic, that it gets exponentially more beautiful when combined and transformed into something that each culture could never have been on its own. And the tragedy of Sicily is how no one else realized that. And sure, this happens to be exactly my aesthetic, but how could anyone miss this?
I mean, this is definitely Blue's kind of thing. I watched enough of their videos at this point to know this man loves Byzantine art and architecture, and he loves medieval Italy. These are like his favorite things.
With those maps and mosaic domes? I swear, Normans are OP. Nerf the damn Normans. Thank you so much
All right.
for watching.
That was a good one. I mean, you guys, good recommendation. You guys know I always love the OSP videos. And, I mean, what I like the most about them is that I find I really align with Blue's sort of perspective on things. I mean, I think our interests differ a little bit, right? This is not my main area of expertise or interest, but first of all, I love all history, right? So I'm happy to listen in, and I find that I really appreciate the way that he presents things and looks at things. I find myself concurring, and it also gives me an opportunity to sort of talk about a lot of related ideas, which I do appreciate. So yeah, I had a good time with this one. If you guys did, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. And with all of that out of the way, I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I'll see you all again next time. Goodbye.